Right, if I could have the panelists just come up to the front, please. And we are running a bit short on time, so I think we'll only be able to take one round of questions. And yeah, I think I'll just open it up to the floor.
You said 10 years.
Yes, are there...
That was 2008, I'm talking about 1990s.
Thanks. Can I pick up on Steve's last point and ask him to just push that a little further? I found your paper really useful, Steve, and clarifying and sharpening of my own thinking. But to come to your point about the urban and the question of urban politics, but given, I want to ask if you can help me link that up, because one of the things which happens in both the Stockholm resilience thinking or the XU thinking, however you Silicon Valley thinking that you frame, is that the urban is seen as a very particular new site of political struggle around sustainability. And I wondered if you could kind of reflect on that. Is that true? Is the urban going to change global governance? Are they wrong? Is it an irrelevant categorization? Is the politics you're talking about local grounded politics? Or does that agglomeration of politics actually matter around questions of sustainability?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's clearly two very different visions here at work here. One is, I think, the one that Simon Mardin very nicely described yesterday in his 5 myths. And this notion whereby we can see large corporate enterprises seeing the opportunity to use the idea of the smart city as a way of basically selling products, gathering information and so on and so forth. But I think there's also another narrative of the city, which is one in which the very notion of social organisation and bottom-up political activity is central. And one of the things that is frequently pointed out about urban life is, for example, whereby you have the concentrations of populations, you have and density of population, you have many more opportunities for interaction, for new ideas to emerge, for new forms of political and social organisation to emerge at the human level. So I guess what I'm arguing is that I think by focusing on the community aspects rather than on the kind of the corporate vision is where I see room for some optimism.
May I come back in?
I'm desperate to find some room for some optimism.
I suppose, so you pick up on the question of the corporates, but I suppose we're sitting with the head of UCLG in the room, United Councils of Local Government, and at least as my understanding is that part of the massive global reconfiguration of politics is around the question of the role of the nation state on things like sustainability, whether it's on climate change or on other elements of sustainability. And the question of the relative importance of city politics to national and global politics is something I wondered how you put that into your frame. And maybe Vanessa has something to say on that too.
So one thing I want to say is that maybe I was completely misunderstood, because what I'm arguing is that we need to go back to what happened in the 90s with the Cities for Climate Protection programs and a lot of other initiatives, and see what kind of politics happened there, what kind of experience were happening there, because some of the sustainability experience can quickly be put aside, but I think there are a lot of other interesting experiences that we are not able to capitalize, and partially it's because not looking at the history. So that's what I was saying. I was not saying in no way that there was no experience in the 90s. I was saying exactly the opposite. And so that's what I wanted to respond. But sorry to not to be able to fully engage with that. maybe we talk about it later, no?
I mean, I think the role of the nation state is problematic, particularly when we start getting into global issues like climate change. Because the way in which nation states represent impacts of climate change in international forums is very often very different from the way in which climate change impacts are manifested and experienced at the local level, where very often it is in fact precisely the actions of national governments constraining in new ways the amount of flexibility that citizens have to respond and reorganize themselves that actually is responsible for the problems rather than any actual discernible change in the climate system.
Thank you for good inspiring presentations. I have just a question for Steve about the three alternatives, three ways of social organization. Because you were contrasting to some extent, let's say the collaborative, cooperative, network-based, network-driven organization. And then on the other extreme, you, as far as I have understood, you have mentioned hierarchy. I mean, that we need to come back to hierarchy. Could you just expand on a little bit the three ways of social organization? Thank you.
Okay. What I'm trying to propose is that there are at least three fundamentally different ways in which human beings organize themselves. One is by egalitarian voluntarism. The second is by hierarchical organization, and the third is by competitive individualism. And the argument that I'm making here is if you only have two of those present, any society can only switch between one and the other, and therefore that's a static system. If you want to have any kind of notion of a dynamic, sustainable development, which is not based on simply a steady state form of organization, you need a minimum of three different forms of organization. You can have more if you want. If you find it useful to distinguish more, that's fine. I'm happy for you to do that. But I'm arguing that you need at least three, because then you can start to combine them in different pairwise combinations, different sequences of development, different patterns of activity, and so forth. That gives you the capacity for complex development.
Thank you. Yeah, another question for you, Steve. You talked a little bit about kind of these intentionally clumsy collaborations or organizations, I guess. Can you give a few examples of where you've seen that work well on maybe a city level? What kind of organizations have been involved, I guess?
Sure. I mean, I'll give you an example of what I would call a clumsy solution to an urban problem. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, economists in the United States were very keen to convince operators of municipal water systems to move to what is known in the US as conservation rate pricing, or here in the UK, rising block pricing, which is basically the inverse of wholesale discounts. In other words, the more water you use, the higher unit price you pay for it. And they were arguing that this would enhance municipal water use efficiency. They made very little progress in terms of convincing either ratepayers or operators of water systems to adopt the system. Now, the small water district of San Juan Capistrano is part of the Metropolitan Water District of Greater Los Angeles. It has no water source of its own at all. It buys every last drop from the Metropolitan Water Authority. It therefore has a huge imperative towards water efficiency. What the local water agency did was quite remarkable. Without any reference to the social science theory, and this also speaks, I think, to something that Eric was talking about earlier today about people actually, about the fact that correct practice, if you like, doesn't depend on correct theory, as Mao asserted, but in fact can arise directly out of experience. The local operators of the Water Authority came up with a scheme for differential charging. What that scheme was that basically every household would have a standard ration of water, regardless, at a very low cost. There was then a second tier of charging, which was based on actual water use over and above your standard ration. And then there was a third tier of charging, which was punitive. Now, they then put this to the local community as a proposal, and they argued this is not that this is an efficient way to charge for water, but it's a fair way to charge for water. And what they had done, without consciously realizing it, was embody three fundamentally different concepts of fairness in the tariff structure. They had an egalitarian concept of fairness, that everybody should basically get the same. Parity as a fairness principle. That was there in the first level. Everybody gets the basic low-cost supply. They then had a... oh, sorry, I missed out something about the second tier. The second tier was determined by looking at the size of your building lot as derived from local real estate records, and a calculation done by a local university as to how much water you would need to apply each month to keep your garden basically in decent shape, recognising that in fact you need less water at different times of the year, so you would get it was monthly variable. So that principle is proportionality. It's another principle of fairness, proportional either to need or to contribution. In this case, proportional to need. In order to be able to be a good neighbour, keep your place looking decent, you need a bit more water than somebody who has a smaller lot. And then the third principle is priority, which is basically I should be able to establish my priorities for how I use my water. I can do that, but I'm going to pay for it. But nobody's stopping me from doing it, but I'm going to pay for it. And the local community readily accepted this tariff framework precisely because different people in the community could recognise that their principle of fairness was embodied in the clumsy emergent solution that these people have come up with. So that, I think, is a nice example of actually not simply the fact that you have three fundamentally different sets of values embodied in there, but the way in which such solutions can emerge actually out of dealing with critical or crisis situations. Sorry, that was a bit long-winded, but I think it might be helpful.
I think that's all the time we have, unfortunately, but I'll ask everyone to now head over to the Nissan Theater for the final keynote, and if you could all join me in thanking our panel.